And let's talk about the biggest news story that's happened over the last few days. Everyone's been talking about it since the news came out. That Sabu has passed away. A legend of the indie scene in the 90s who was really one of the main people involved with transforming ECW from just being a regional company to something that people needed to see. Why don't we talk a little bit about Sabu and his place in wrestling history?
And 60 years old, by the way, and just wrestled his retirement match last month, which we'll get to. But here I've been dreading this because I don't want people to think that I'm being disrespectful if I don't have all these great memories, because as I told you, I have literally in over the past 30 years said hello to him in passing at a convention or a wrestling show or two, as we'll talk about, like 5 times. And I'm seeing all these guys that, that he worked with and that he knew, posting things and everything. I have no personal experience whatsoever. And I'll explain again why we just were never in the same fucking place, almost never. And so I don't have any personal anecdote, but also I have nothing personally against him, or, so I'm not biased in any way on a personal basis, except what that I've, heard and observed. And you can probably help remind me of things as well. But I mean, the thing is, we'll get to this, but you have to just you're not shocked anymore because it's wrestling and with the amount of people that die. But still, when somebody just did their retirement match last month, it comes out of the blue, is what I'm trying to say as I beat around the bush. So and the first time, and I think I told you this also, we talked about it on the phone. The first time that I had met him, and just briefly, was that Gordon Scazzari show in 1991, right? That had to be when it
Gordon
was.
Scazzari show was in 91, yeah.
And for those of you who don't know, real quickly, this fucking kid in Massachusetts had come into money and thought he was going to be a wrestling promoter and booked a show in a small building in Massachusetts somewhere with the most eclectic group of wrestling personalities you've ever seen. And Eddie Gilbert was going to be his booker and wrote the TVs and then didn't show up. Remember, he didn't come to the actual fucking TV.
You want to talk about a good Eddie Gilbert story that Dark Side missed, when Jeff Gaylord attacked him at the Sportatorium because apparently Scazzari paid him off.
Yes.
To teach Eddie a lesson.
Before the guy went broke and was committed to, from what I understand, to a mental institution, he paid Jeff Gaylord to beat Eddie Gilbert up for stiffing him on the. But nevertheless, at that taping, and Brian, you would have fucking blew snot. He had booked the Sheik because Gordon Scazzari was a big wrestling fan, right? I mean, Paul Orndorff was there. Stan Lane and I were there. That's why I was there. There was a variety of talent from all over the place, but he booked the Sheik. The Sheik brought Sabu, and some way or another, Dr. Mike Lano got to be the Sheik and Sabu's manager and had a fucking turban on and was in his regular fucking Dr. Mike Lano suit, but with a turban, out there doing promos for him.
The promos. Sabu, I think, wrestled 2 matches. One of them, funny enough, was against Chris Candido. And the Sheik's around ringside doing his thing. Lano, who was actually at ringside shooting photos earlier that night.
Yes.
Walks out,
came back out,
puts on a turban. You say he was doing promos. Yeah, they did a promo after the match. He got on the mic during the match. And as Sabu's doing moves that no one had ever seen before, he's like, look at the mighty Sabu. We've got all the money. Jushin Liger. He's just saying random shit. No one's paying attention to him. They're trying to pay attention to the ring, but he's distracting. And then I believe he took photos again later that night.
Yes, and he went back out. Yes, and I was just sitting there watching most of the night because I was supposed to do the TV commentary, but they forgot to set up a fucking announce position, the TV crew, and they had no way to do commentary. So the guy said, I'll bring you back and we'll do it in post, right? Yeah. It was commentaryless last time I saw it. But anyway, and yes, you're right. He did work with Candida, and Tammy was there because I remember. Again, this was right as I'd met them, or right after I'd met them. When they were working for Dennis Corluzzo. So anyway, the point is, I knew Sabu there from seeing him, and then yes, the videotapes, which we'll get into. But the next time I saw him was like 1993. I had just started for the WWF, and Sabu had got the tryout match, and somebody retweeted it the other day with the time code numbers on the bottom of the tape and everything. So I don't know where it came from. But Sabu had gotten a tryout match, I assume from Bruce Pritchard, probably, because I don't think Pat Patterson was paying attention to VHS tapes of, indie shows at that point. And so he was there, and I figure he's the Sheik's nephew, and kids trying to get a shot because I'm talking to Vince McMahon in the hallway, and Sabu walks through there. And I made a point of saying, "Oh, Vince, this is Sabu, the Sheik's nephew. Does a lot of amazing stuff, right?" And Vince, "Oh, I'll be sure to watch," or whatever the fuck. And then he had the trap match was Scotty Taylor, Scotty Too Hottie. And they didn't get it. Because I think he suffered.
The fans got into it.
Well, but that's the thing is that Vince did, because part of it was Al Snow syndrome. Because Sabu, a couple times he tried to do the deal where he jumps and he landed on the top rope and he flipped backwards and arm dragged the guy or whatever. But it was ropes, whatever. He slipped on a couple things, but also when he dove over the top rope, he gave a tope or a flying cannonball or whatever it was to Scotty, and he just landed boom on the floor. And I mean, I wasn't on the creative team at this point in time, so I was in no inner office discussions about it. But I can tell you that Vince didn't get it. That's one of the things he didn't get. He's like, "What the fuck? This guy's going to kill himself." And that's it. It was not the style that was in any way going to be featured at that point in time. And by the time that it was, everybody else had already stolen all of Sabu's shit, and they were already doing it. And he never got the run to take advantage of it.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I see him akin to Tiger Mask. Again, there's a lot of differences. But for a few years, everywhere Sabu went, he changed the way everyone who worked after him worked. And in 93, the buzz really started getting big early in the year. He had a match for Dennis in Minnesota, NWA Grand Slam, him against the Lightning Kid, right before Sean Waltman went to the WWF. And no one had ever seen a lot of that stuff before. That was one of the things that got the Lightning Kid over, because he was really skinny and everything, but he was doing a lot of stuff that no one had ever seen before. And that match had a lot of buzz. And by the time you get to the end of the year, Paul Heyman takes over as the Booker of ECW. He brings in Sabu on a gurney coming out there. One of his bodyguards was 911. That was the start of 911 in ECW, and he became a big thing for a while there. Originally managed by Hunter Q. Robbins III, Robin Hunt, and then eventually managed by Heyman. I think I tweeted this out, I'm not sure. I think he may have been the last person managed by Heyman as Paulie Dangerously.
Well, and that's it. And first of all, by the way, I think they should have stuck with it, and that should have been the thing they always did. The Hannibal Lecter on the board with the face thing entrance of Sabu. That is one of the things that I liked about what they did with him and what they could have done with him. And it's no secret I was in no way a fan of the actual wrestling style, which we'll get to in a second. But the gimmick and the fucking presentation, and again, he could have been produced if he listened to somebody besides his uncle, he could have been produced and could have done something. And Paul Lee saw that. Even Paul Lee wasn't going to, go as far as Sabu would go later on, having a top being Sabu. But the presentation and the gimmick, Paul E saw, I've got the modern day Sheik. I've got to manage this personally. And because he knew part of the deal was he can't talk. Well, with Paul E, he didn't have to. And he had everything else. And Paul E was the only one in the business willing to let guys go that far at that time with the, various things they went that far with.
I remember the first time I heard his voice. That kind of threw me off. It was backstage at a Dennis show in 95. It was a big show at that moment for Dennis with his local guys. Because Sabu was on the outs with ECW. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Paulie turned the fans on him. And he was working with Devin Storm, who at that time, I would say was the top local guy for Dennis and was the top high flyer for Dennis. And it was a big deal for us nerds into that indie wrestling. And I think it was in Woodbridge or Woodbury. I always get the two confused. Woodbury, I guess it is.
Yes.
And it was a great match. And we all went out to eat afterwards. But when I was with Georgie and Macropolis, and she had a good relationship with Sabu, and she, oh, hi, honey. And he started talking to him. And I hear, yeah. I was like, it threw me off. I didn't know what I expected. I expected something, but it was just very, like almost like Beavis and Butthead-ish, the first time I heard it. And it threw me off, but it was a spectacle. Everywhere he went, it was a spectacle. And back to ECW, the buzz around Paul Heyman's ECW was around Terry Funk, who was doing amazing work considering his age, Sabu, and maybe a bit about Shane Douglas in the early days because of the promos.
But then Shane wore off quick.
Well, like Dominic Mysterio talking about moonsaults, when you say fucking shit every time, it takes away the impact of the first time you said, you piece of shit. Oh my God, I've never heard anyone say that. But Sabu was like kind of the face and the feel of ECW. And when you think about tables, when you think about Public Enemy in ECW and then leaving ECW, going to WCW and walking to the ring with tables, or the Dudleys, and quite frankly, the tables were the most popular member of the Dudleys tag team. That all came from Sabu. And it wasn't just using tables in matches. He did a thing where after his matches, he'd be so upset that he didn't cripple his opponent. He would put a table in the middle of the ring and moonsaulted himself.
And moonsault the table, even if it would. I used to say, why is he mad at the furniture? But he'd do it 2 or 3 times if it wouldn't break.
Well, that was before they were that was before they were cutting tables or trimming them or whatever they do. So they were just not gimmick tables. He would take in the ring and just moonsault the shit out of them.
Well, I got news for you. They don't really. I don't know what some goofball indie guy might do, but they don't cut the fucking tables. They were a lot of times, especially back in those days, they were just grabbing whatever kind of table it was around ringside to do that. And it was feast or famine sometime as far as what kinds you got, whether it would go break or whatever. And there's little tricks for some of these modern ones, but nevertheless, we would get bogged down. This is the point that I'm going to make, because again, don't want to be disrespectful to the fellow that I barely had any interaction with whatsoever. If he had been the only one, fine, because the Sheik was the only one. That's why he was a huge draw. But when everybody in ECW, and I blame Paul more than the talent, they're just after Paul turned the ECW people on Sabu more in a moment, everybody else got to steal his shit. But the table becoming you can't get around it. You can't look away from it multiple times in every fucking match. It's so goddamn overdone. That's why if Sabu had been able to have some type of protected status, as the Sheik did, where he was the only one with this incredible fucking over-the-top bullshit stuff, then it would have been fucking fine. But when everybody started doing it, now we can't get rid of it 30 years later. And so he's kind of like Mick Foley in that respect, to taking bumps off of high fucking places. We can't get rid of the furniture fucking either. But Sabu never got a chance to cash in on it because everybody took his shit and ran with it, and there was no structure to modern wrestling to make him the only guy. And like I said to you the other day, if you had one Sheik, you had a mega box office attraction. But if you had same territory, 18 guys working like the Sheik, you were out of business.
And, you know, he was one of the top stars in ECW, one of the most over guys by far. And I think when you went to a lot of those ECW shows, you wanted to see Sabu. There was a buzz about him. And then, off the top of my head, the way I remember it was Sabu had a tour for New Japan because he had previously been working for FMW with his uncle. I mean, that was one of the first clips people saw was when the ring was on fire. He was with his uncle in that match.
Yes, where they almost killed the Sheik. And put him in the hospital with whatever degree burns. And no, he had a shot for New Japan, and he wasn't going to be able to get back in time for the big triple threat match or whatever that Paul had built up to. But he got the chance to work for New Japan, and he didn't want to give it up or whatever the case. And so Paulie did an even bigger job than Vince did on Austin when Austin walked out not to do the job to Brock.
Yeah. Paulie went in the ring and he turned Sabu into a heel in front of the ECW arena crowd. I don't even remember if it aired on TV or anything. I would think it was just him trashing Sabu in front of the crowd because Sabu took the New Japan tour as opposed to the one ECW arena date. And again, we don't know what the communication was or anything else, but he went in there and turned the crowd on Sabu, and those ECW arena fans, and a lot of them were smart, but a lot of them thought they were smart, but they were really just slurping up anything Paulie gave them. And they were like fucking, like walruses, just doing whatever he wanted to.
Slurp is a good word. I like slurp.
Whether it was the Flair is dead shit for Shane or whether it was the fuck Sabu chant. And those ECW arena fans who had gone nuts for Sabu, Paulie could have come out there and said anything to them. They would just change on a dime what they thought about something. And Sabu all of a sudden became persona non grata there. That's when he started working for Dennis again. And Dennis in ECW, Dennis Carluzzo, had always had problems going back to pre-Paul because Dennis didn't get along with Todd Gordon. Dennis got along with Eddie Gilbert. But Dennis didn't get along with Todd Gordon. But ECW wouldn't let their guys work for Dennis. And a lot of those guys worked for Dennis for Terry Funk, Sabu. A lot of those guys worked for Dennis before ECW was a thing. So that created a lot of the problems, but Sabu went back to working
remember,
for Dennis.
that was supposed to be the handshake in the limo between Paul and Dennis for me to go to the ECW arena that time was supposed to be, and the ECW guys could work for Dennis on their days off in Cherry Hill or whatever, which didn't happen.
No. And that was the year 95 where he showed up. It was like maybe the third episode of Nitro or something. It was Sabu against Mr. JL, Jerry Lynn in a mask. I still don't understand why. He was Jerry Lynn. Why'd you have to put him on the mask? Mr. JL. Not even a cool name. Mr. JL. Who will figure this out? And
that's why the Destroyer got even bigger as Mr. DB.
And, this was the era where Nitro was only an hour. So they still had like a bunch of shit, but nothing went longer than like 6 minutes. And maybe it should be like that today, quite frankly. And Sabu was in and out quick. And then in 96, he returns to ECW. And you want to talk about another thing that was really popularized due to Sabu. If Heyman did it before then, I can't remember a specific instance, but the one I remember the most, turned out the lights, turned them back on. Taz was already in the ring, and there was Sabu. You could almost hear the fan, Sabu! Oh, they turned back. All you had to do was come back, and they turned back to loving him. And that set up the big Sabu Taz thing, which maybe Paul Heyman's greatest job as a promoter because he convinced people that may be a good match. And it never could live up to the hype because they did a better job of hyping up Taz then, Sabu also. And then they did a double switch where Bill Alfonso switched from Taz to Sabu. And that began Sabu with Bill Alfonso and eventually with Rob Van Dam.
And you're right. I'm not going to say the lights had never gone out before. But then, again, lights went out all the time. And then other people started doing it. And then they'd go out and come back on and go out and come back on again. So
I never liked it. I never liked it because, like, even that instance, Taz, I forget what Taz was doing. Taz, like, beating someone up. Lights go out. Enough time for Sabu to run to the ring. Lights come back on. Taz has his hands crossed, his arms crossed. Sabu's pointing up in his familiar pose. And then they get ready like they're going to do something. And then the lights go off again and everyone's gone. Like, that to me is the epitome of Paul Heyman.
When I was there, I was in that building one time in my life, and the lights went out for me to come to the ring.
That's like the ultimate Paul Heyman lazy booking thing. And then you're like, Paul, why'd you do that? Well, it worked. People popped. It worked. Yeah, but it didn't have an ending. It went nowhere. It made no sense.
Where did they go?
Yeah, how did it happen? Who's the light man? What's going on? Well, it worked. They popped. And, again, Sabu, when the WWE and ECW did their thing in 97, Sabu was involved with that. But he was really, I think, for a lot of people.
Well, and here's the thing. I was there that night. Remember in 97, he didn't actually get on television because at the Manhattan Center, it was him and Van Dam that Paul had there was some kind of motor home, or not a mobile home, but a motor home of a camper, as they used to call it. And Paul was relaying back and forth what Van Dam and supposedly what Van Dam and Sabu were saying and wanted to do or demanded or whatever. But he was trying to. One of them ended up working. I don't know if the other one did. I can't remember. We've talked about it before, but from a Paul standpoint, but that's when he was trying to protect his guys, but also put the heat on them rather than him, just in case something happened. So he was communicating back, as Lawler told Reggie B. Fine on Memphis TV, come out here or bring your guy out here. Reggie B. Fine said, you just tell me what you want him to know and I'll delay the information back to him. Paul was delaying the information back and forth, and Sabu never got a job again with the WWF, I don't think. Well, no, then they redid ECW 10 years later, right?
And then him and Van Dam got busted smoking weed in a car when Van Dam was the champion, remember?
That's right, and they fired him again.
But, him and he's really responsible for getting Van Dam on the national stage in a lot of ways, because Rob Van Dam had worked first time I saw him was Eddie Mansfield's IWF on Sports Channel in New York. And then he was in WCW briefly in the beginning of 93 as Robbie V. Not even Rob Van Dam, Robbie V. And
yeah,
he was such a bland baby face, and it didn't do anything for me. And then he did some All Japan stuff because I think Dory Jr. got him booked. And his promos as a nice karate-loving babyface, it didn't really, he didn't seem like he had the voice for it or anything else. And then they started working with Sabu, his longtime friend, in ECW in the summer of 96. I went to one match they had. It was a nightmare. It was the hottest, it must have been like the middle of the summer. It was so hot in that building, the AC went down, and then the ring broke, and then they fixed the ring, and they start Sabu versus Rob Van Dam, and Sabu goes to do his triple jump moonsault where he puts the chair in the ring, and he runs, and he jumps on the chair, and then he jumps on the top rope, and he moonsaults back, and the top rope, the ring broke again.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
It was just the worst night. That may have been the night Kimono Wanalea danced atop the ECW arena, I'm not sure. But Rob Van Dam getting over in ECW was because they started doing a lot of stuff with him and Sabu, and then eventually he turned heel, and it kind of clicked. And I think the stuff with WWE was a big part of that. The Mr. Monday Night thing, taking that back to ECW as a heel.
Yeah. And like I was telling you with what Vince got at that time, Van Dam by that point had gained weight and had a fucking physique and the flexibility.
And cool trunks.
I've called him, well, and cool trunks, but I've called him the modern version of Argentina Rocca because he did unorthodox shit, but it worked for him and nobody else could land on their various joints, knees, ankles, in those positions, contort themselves and do that shit. But he also looked like a goddamn top guy and a little cleaner look. And that's what Vince was looking for. And with Sabu, the difference in the work, whereas Van Dam could jump off the top rope and do the 5-star frog splash and land on you and bounce, and that's physically impactful shit. But whereas Sabu shit was launching himself over or off the top rope or off of something onto somebody and, cross fingers, hope for the best in the way he landed. And Vince's head would blow up at shit like that. And in this case, I don't blame him that much, because you're looking at, and we've seen the highlights that they put out of Sabu's, ECW stuff and compilations and everything. You've got to admit that in most of those things where he's diving somewhere to take somebody through a table or into the barbed wire, whatever, you can't apply the standard wrestling logic that we can do this, the two of us as trained professionals, in this way and have a reasonable expectation of not getting hurt. You can't apply that to that shit. That's why Vince wouldn't fucking go for most of it. And that's why a whole generation of wrestlers wouldn't go for it. And it was the younger guys that were doing this shit because you couldn't talk anybody into it that was at the time over and already had a job. And I don't mean to denigrate the man. But when I look at this stuff, even today, I'm going, you can't. There's the thunder now, Brian. Are you hearing the thunder?
I thought there was no thunder over Louisville.
Well, they rescheduled it for today. You can't look at that and say, okay, the people perpetrating this had a reasonable expectation that they could pull it off without getting hurt. And that's why I can get into the athletic aspect of wrestling and I can get into the violent part of it. But the art of the violence of wrestling is that the violent part has to be controlled as the athletic part. And I didn't want to be on either side, pitching or catching, of anything that those guys were fucking doing.
And eventually it really did go too far, at least for me as a fan. In 94, that was kind of the year that you got all these Sabu dream matches and all the best of Sabu compilation tapes started going around, because every match he had was a thing that had to be seen. That was the year we got Cactus Jack against Sabu, because Cactus left WCW, and that was like the big dream match. Two guys that don't care about their bodies wrestling each other. That was a big deal, and they had a few matches. I think they had one in Hamburg that they aired on ECW TV later in the year. And then that was the year that we got Sabu versus Terry Funk a bunch of times. And where I was going with this, because I'll come back, the match they had, I think in 97, the barbed wire one, I love Terry Funk and I like a lot of that Sabu stuff. That was too much for me. Yeah. That was too gruesome and too far and too disgusting. And I actually worried about people I like watching too much. But if you go back to 94, he has the three-way match with Terry and Shane, which doesn't really hold up as well now, but at the time was a big deal. And then one of my favorite ECW moments ever. It's supposed to be Terry Funk against Mr. Hughes. The Bruise Brothers come out and attack Mr. Hughes and beat him up. I forget what their problem with Mr. Hughes was. I don't know. I've seen their tattoos. Who knows what their problem with Mr. Hughes was? But now Terry Funk doesn't have an opponent. He says, I'll wrestle anybody. Paul E hits the ring and says, I know who you should wrestle. And as soon as he's done, the fans are already, Sabu! They know who it's going to be. And he says, Sabu. And then when Terry Funk turns around, he clocks him with the phone. And then Terry Funk goes down. Paulie starts doing the promo to introduce Sabu as being wheeled out. Terry puts a plastic bag over Paul's head and tries to kill him. So then Sabu gets in there, and Sabu and Terry have one of the best matches I think they ever had. And at the end, the bodyguards who had helped bring Sabu out on the gurney and everything, and they were out there still, come in there and they get unmasked and thrown out. And it's like some of the local guys, like Donnie Allen or whoever it was. And eventually one of them, it's Bobby Eaton, beautiful Bobby. He hit the Alabama Jam. People are like, what the fuck? Who's that? And then he pulls it off and it's Bobby Eaton, and the place goes nuts out of nowhere. Because who expected this? Arn Anderson runs out of the back of ECW Arena. And if you ever watch the footage, it's incredible because someone who must have been involved with ECW next to the camera yells, holy shit, it's Arn Anderson! And it's not supposed to be there. You could tell it's just someone terribly excited. And they go in there and the place goes, I can still see Sarge McGee in the front row, lifting his arms up. He couldn't believe it. And then they had the tag match.
I can't believe Sarge could lift his arms up at that point. But
Arn and Terry Funk versus Sabu and Bobby Eaton. And
Well, and also we should say for the kids out there that think we're all on drugs, that was when Paul got a settlement over the copyright infringement, whatever
No,
lawsuit he had filed. Which lawsuit was it he had filed against WCW?
see, I think it was a different one because the copyright thing for When Worlds Collide, when they did the AAA pay-per-view, funny enough, they're using that name for the thing coming up. That's what caused November 94 against the NWA tournament in Cherry Hill. In Philadelphia, Paulie got Brian Pillman because he was supposed to get Steve Austin and Steve Austin couldn't do it, or he was hurt. I forget what it was. Got Brian Pillman. I think he got Kevin Sullivan back that night. I think he got Sherry Martel back that night. And I may be forgetting one other person.
No, this was some kind of settlement that he got in the some other infringement.
It may have been for everything with Watts.
Mike Awesome and Taz had a title match that era of time. Anyway, Paul was always getting talent because he would sue WCW for something. And he got Arn and Bobby that night. And it tickled me when I heard about it because that's the same two guys I got every time that somebody could get talent from WCW. They wanted Arn Anderson and Bobby Eaton.
Yeah, that feud went to that feud went to 3 different promotions in a year. That's what made it so cool. But that year also we got Sabu versus Too Cold Scorpio, which was again another one of those like, holy shit, how's this gonna happen? And then my favorite was from a show Dan Farron promoted in the middle of a residential neighborhood in California. They did Al Snow versus Sabu. No one had ever heard of Al Snow outside of people going to Michigan Independence and fans of the late version of the Fabulous Kangaroo. No one had ever heard of Al Snow until those matches from Michigan started going around to him against Sabu. That put Al Snow on the map for a lot of people. That's what got him booked in ECW in 95. And those matches are great. They brought it out to California for this show. And it was a really, really fun match. And at the very end, out of nowhere, because he wasn't on the card, he wasn't booked, and this is a residential street in the middle of the day in California, Terry Funk runs in. And the place starts going crazy. Terry starts beating the shit out of that. There's just a big fight everywhere. The woman who ran the building freaked out because she didn't know who this man was attacking everyone. So she calls the cops. And now the video ends right before the cops get there, and outside, Dan Farron, the promoter and referee here, is on the ground. Again, middle of the day, he's on the ground. Terry Funk is hiding under a car.
Like the Sheik in Chicago.
And the video ends with Terry Funk walking down the street. There are houses there. It's just that street. Just walking down the street muttering to himself. But, you know, again, Sabu and Terry Funk, during that period of time, if you were a tape trader, you wanted to see every single thing they did, no matter where it was.
And even if it was under a car on a side street in Southern California.
Yeah.
That's the thing is, I think, especially, you know, we know that Paul E will let guys go too far and didn't, you know, particularly look out for anybody's best interests physically. But I think in his quest to go so extreme and to go too far and push the envelope and set people, God damn it, wasn't Sabu in the deal where they set people on fire too? Or where Terry got set on fire?
That may have been him and Terry, yeah. That may have been him against Terry, I think.
They swung the chair. And people, they had to evacuate the lights went out as people were on fire, and they had to evacuate the building. It was filling with smoke. Wonderful place to take the kids. They get 2-for-1 admission, folks. But I think if Vince had been more up to date at that point, and Paulie had been a little less behind the times, maybe, and there'd have been a sweet spot in the middle, Sabu as a gimmick and as a personality, and with the stuff that he could do without even doing furniture in every match, or
the look too,
you know, bleeding constantly from any orifice, or the really dangerous stuff that requires surgical repair. I mean, with the cool entrance and the music and a manager and the whole thing, I think he'd have made more money than he did diving off the roof through a bunch of shit in the fucking, you know, rec centers. But as what I was saying the other day, he took the Sheik's advice on how to be a star and stay over and maintain your drawing power and etc., But the part that he skipped was the Sheik didn't do all that until he was one of the biggest, most powerful guys in the business and the owner of a territory. Then he'd do whatever he wanted. And Sabu skipped that part. He wasn't the owner of a major promotion or one of the biggest stars in the business before they let him do his shit, which is why nobody on a mainstream, AKA high paying basis would let him do any of that stuff, because with no control over it at all, instead of the danger with the Sheik was that he was going to fucking blade somebody too deep, but he never like put anybody in a hospital for surgery. But with Sabu, and guys cooperating with all of that on a mainstream big money basis, you can't. And now they don't even let guys in modern day do shit as out of control and as recklessly as the stuff that these guys were doing in ECW and then those indies in the early 2000s. If you look back at the clips, it's like I can't imagine how some of them were not paralyzed.
I remember Bob Barnett telling me a story that he went out east for a Joel Goodhart show, probably 91, maybe 92, but probably 91. Actually, it had to be 91 now that I think about it. And Sabu was booked. I think he was in like a reverse battle royal, whatever it was, one of those early card gimmick matches just to get everyone on the show. But he was driving the Sheik's limousine. And the Sheik was with him, because I think it may have been the Sheik versus Abdullah or something.
Okay, yes.
And Bob Barnett somehow got to talking to them at the hotel or whatever, and he was going to the building too, so they were going to follow him. And he said, I remember him telling me, he goes, it's first time he met Sabu. Sabu came over to my car and he said, my uncle says if you get us lost, he's going to cut you. And he didn't get lost. He got to the building.
Oh, the pressure is on. If I'd have got lost, I'd have just sped off and left him. They just gone back home.
He had a look too, in terms of what could have been if different things had happened or anything. The scars all over his body, no one else in wrestling had that. And it worked.
Not sure I'd want to go that far, but if they were already there, you could have used them.
Yeah.
Right?
It was a great look. He had a unique look. Even when everyone started stealing every part of what he did,
his repertoire,
he still had a unique look, even though there were copies. I remember when Pablo Marquez, the first time I heard of Pablo Marquez, he was a Sabu ripoff called Ubaz.
Yes.
Sabu backwards, Ubaz.
Yeah.
So, there was an influence among some people from Sabu, but, he, to me.
You know what? It is a lot like Mick Foley, because there was I hate to say this, but for, same thing with Mick, and I love Mick to death and everybody knows it, but they were both guys that the young male audience at the time said, I'll never look like these guys. I'll never look like Bret Hart or Shawn Michaels or Ric Flair or whatever, but that fat guy or that little fucking scarred up guy, I could do that shit. And it was kind of like a bonding moment for that generation.
I remember Marty Gorman being asked years ago, Marty, what's your favorite match of all time? And his answer was Sabu. That was just any match he saw Sabu in was his favorite match. And again, like I said, there was a period of time there where, that's why I compare it to Tiger Mask. Even though Sayama did the UWF and Sayama eventually had comeback matches later on when he, was not Little Tiger Mask anymore. For a couple of years there, everything he did influenced everything that came after it. From the weight division to the style to everything. And I think with Sabu, it's a lot of the same thing. Again, for good or for bad, I'm looking at it as a teenage Mark from the 90s, not as a indie professional like yourself.
Yes.
But if you look at where we are today, how much of that is directly because of what Sabu started doing in front of wrestling fans? And also, what would ECW have even been if they didn't have Sabu?
Now you're fired me up to get indignant again. That's the problem. Well, in all seriousness, and I hate the fact that, again, a lot of what people were talking about over the last day or so is that he never even made a lot of big money for doing this shit and was broken down his body and etc. But with Tiger Mask, yes, you're correct in the same level of influence with a completely different style, etc. Because with Tiger Mask, you said, my God, That guy's a world-class athlete. Nobody can do that like he can. This is amazing athleticism. With Sabu, you were like, Jesus Christ, this guy's going to kill himself. And I just, because I came from the previous generation of wrestling and was trained by the previous generation from that, I was like, what the fuck? Why is anybody allowing this to go on? To be quite honest with you, but it's goddamn exciting to watch.
I remember you being asked when I was probably 14 at Fan Week. If it wasn't 14, it was 15. Why don't you use Sabu? Because again, this is the period of time where he was the hottest thing. Even though he's working a lot for Paul, that may have caused the problem. And you at the time, I remember, not even talking about money or negotiating or anything. You couldn't wrap your head around what to do with him because he'd be a heel. So he couldn't exactly do everything he's doing as a heel, but you may want him to do some of those things not necessarily in an offensive way. Am I saying this in any way that makes sense?
Well, yeah. See, here's the thing, and we've talked about it in a different Eddie Gilbert when we were talking about the Dark Side episode. What worked in Philadelphia wouldn't work in Memphis. What worked in Memphis wouldn't work in Philadelphia, vice versa, right? And at the time for the audience, how do I bring Sabu in and introduce him when he doesn't speak as a babyface? And how does he interact with the rest of my baby faces against the fucking heels? It wasn't the indie style presentation that Paul was doing, picking up from ECW and from Joe Goodhart and all that type of thing. It was regular weekly episodic television, monthly show, territorial wrestling. If he was a heel and had a manager could speak for him, he'd get a lot of fucking heat doing some of that shit to Ricky Morton or Tracy Smothers. But at the same time, there was too much margin for error with most of his. I didn't want the fans to see that stuff, because that's the problem. Once they see it, they can't unsee it. And then they want to see more of it. And then you give them more. And then gradually the stunt show aspect takes over. And that's what they pop on rather than the personalities and the issues and what you can give them safely. And then you have a situation where guys have to fucking hospitalize themselves on a regular basis just to give the normal performance, kind of like what we've got today. So I was trying to slow that shit down.
Well, again, Sabu, when you look at the 90s, he's definitely one of the faces of wrestling in that era. Unlike a lot of guys that were indie stars, again, independent wrestling really changed right around the time Ring of Honor became popular. It may have started a little bit before then, but that really was like the point where independent wrestling became a different animal. But the big stars in indie wrestling were the Terry Funks, the Cactus Jacks, the Eddie Gilberts, the guys who had national TV exposure. With Sabu, it kind of started switching. It was all about buzz from smart wrestling fans trading tapes, which aren't necessarily the people that are going to fill the room, but they'll be in the room making noise while other people are discovering it. And again, for good or for bad, there are very few people that had as big an influence on everything we see today than Sabu, whether it's the tables, whether it's the lights being put out to do something. A lot of these things.
Well, and now, you know what? A lot of people are going to say, and Cornette was taking a piss out of him for it. No, I took the piss out of everybody that copied it and the promoters that allowed it and the promoters that fell back on the lights as a crutch or the tables as a crutch or the people that controlled the shows not saying, okay, we're going a little too far here when we're lynching each other with fucking barbed wire around our testicles or whatever. And if Sabu was going to have that gimmick, which was the update of the Sheik, the wild, hardcore guy, but instead of cutting people with a razor blade and wrapping a snake around their neck, he was throwing them through tables, then it should have been protected. And somebody should have been able to produce him well enough that he could assimilate into a major promotion, so that if he was going to take that many chances with his body, which didn't, obviously, he didn't emerge unscathed from that he would have got compensated for it.
Yeah, that is one of the sad things that apparently he did not do. I mean, it's not a surprise when you think of some of the places he worked, but apparently he did not do very well throughout his career financially, or at least to the level of a top star in a major company. Although even if he did, you have to wonder if he would have still been working. I mean, we'll talk about it a little bit later. He just had his retirement match a couple weeks ago. He hadn't really worked too much in the years before then because of things that were happening physically. I mean, he had gone through a lot physically. But, like his grandfather, like his uncle, not his grandfather, his uncle, ladies and gentlemen, like his uncle, the Sheik, Sheik, I think, would have kept doing stuff. As long as someone was willing to pay, the Sheik would probably find a way to get there.
No, it was Sheik. It was 70 when he did how old was he when he did the Burning Ring match in Japan? He was already 70, or was he 72?
He was in his 70s when he was working for FMW, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, yes, the point being, because we talked about that on the Sheik Dark Side episode, he fell on hard times financially over the last 30 years of his life. Because of the first 40 years of his life, he established that he lived at this certain level and he couldn't downsize and have the fame taken away and not, whatever. With Sabu, he never lived at that level, but he had the Sheik's example to look up to. So it was, nevertheless, they liked the limelight.
60 years old, Sabu. And again, go back and watch some of the footage of him in 93 and 94 if you want to see him at a period of time where the fans had never seen anything like that before, so you get some really interesting reactions from people. But that is our look at Sabu. Jim, in the awkward transition department, Sabu had a lot of scars all over his body. And he wouldn't have had that problem if he was just focused on his face and using a safe razor like our friends at Harry's.
Well, you have that exactly right, Brian, because for heaven's sake, if you're talking about the Sheik or any of the Sheik's relatives, you've got to mention that this show is partially sponsored by a razor blade company. And our friends at Harry's, they've got them covered up, so you can't cut yourself accidentally. And even if you take one of these things and try to just run it across your forehead willy-nilly, you couldn't really do too much damage because they're made to scrape your face in a safe and affordable way rather than cutting your head in a dangerous but potentially profitable way. But they got the German-engineered blades made in their own factory that stay sharp longer. The customizable delivery options for scheduled refills, half what you're going to pay for the big brands. And you get the 5-blade razor, the weighted handle, the foaming shave gel, and a travel cover for only $6. It's regular $10, but now you're going to save $6. Or you're going to save $4 because it's $6. You see, now 10 minus 4 is 6. Unless on one side, the 100 gorillas have a fucking... Is it 100 gorillas against one man? I guess that wouldn't be fair.
That seems like it would be a problem. The gorillas may start fighting with each other.
Well, so what you need to do is you need to get your Harry's customized trial set, and you need to shave a couple of the gorillas. Put them on the right side of things. But again, folks, if you want to make your face smooth and attractive to others, possibly of the opposite sex or maybe the same sex, which you know what? With most of the listeners, I wouldn't rule anything out because you'll increase your potential gene pool.
Once again,
but if you want to,
your face,
yes, you got to make yourself attractive.
Your face will be smooth and kissable if you do your razoring the right way with the right razor.
Whether it be man, woman, or puppy, you might want the puppy to give you a puppy kiss.
Well, I believe these are. I don't know if there is a disclaimer or anything, but I believe these are recommended for human beings only.
No, if you want to shave your face slick so your puppy will give you a puppy kiss.
I thought you were saying shave the puppy's face. I was like, what's wrong with this man?
No, you don't shave the puppy's face for heaven. When do you ever shave the puppy's? You shave the puppy's ass. If you get your Harry's 5-blade razor with the weighted handle and foaming shave gel and go to town on Fido's sphincter.
Go to town on your mustache.
The shit stains on the carpet will vanish instantly.
Fido's sphincter is a term we use on the show to describe the facial hair on someone's face. Go to town on your face. Get rid of that beard. Clean up that beard. Get rid of that mustache or do something else. Whatever it may be. You need a razor and you need the right razor, and we can recommend our friends at Harry's.
You know, I saw Santa Claus at a Christmas special, and he had a long Fido sphincter hanging down to his belly. Folks, right now, normally that trial set is $10, but you can get it for just $6. So if it really means that much to you to save $4, you fucking cheap bastard, go right now to harrys.com/JCE. That's HARRYS.com/JCE. $6 for the trial set that's normally $10. Save that $4. You cheap bastard, you. If that's the only thing that's kept you from just buying some Harry's before is that lousy $4, I hate to think of what kind of fucking life you've led or how much a loser you are. Harrys.com /JCE.
For all the winners, harrys.com/JCE.
Yeah, shave that face or that sphincter.
Be a winner. Shave that face with Harry's.
It says be a winner, shave that sphincter.
The face, the sphincter of the face. I don't even know what that means, but harrys.com/JCE.